Hello and welcome back to a season-ending edition of Hockey Talkie. My name is Clay. Thank you for tuning in. The Blackhawks season has concluded, unfortunately, with no playoffs this season. So it is now time for us to kind of look back at this season as a whole. That's what this video is about. We're going to review it. We're going to talk about the season. We're going to go through all the players who played for the Hawks this year, talk about how they did and what we can expect from them in the future. I apologize if this is a super long video. I don't know how long it is right now recording this intro segment, so I'm hoping, it's not like 40 minutes long, but there's a lot of players that we're going to be going through. There's like 37 players, so I'm going to try to not spend a whole lot of time on any one single player. But apologies in advance if I do. If you're looking at that video length right now and you're like reassessing your life choices, I'm sorry. Now, before we get into the players specifically, let's just take a moment to talk about the season as a whole, how it kind of went down. Coming into the year, we knew we were officially rebuilding. It was probably going to be rough. We were missing a couple key players, had questions. We had a lot of young guys, didn't know what we had at goaltender, right? And the first couple of games of the season, Tampa Bay and Florida, not great. Didn't really help. The idea of, sticking around to watch this team play this year, definitely thoughts of, this team's going to be fighting for that first overall pick in the upcoming entry-level draft. But the month of February, the team played really well. The power play was super hot. Goaltending was pretty darn good. We got some guys, producing. We were playing some weaker opponents too. Everything kind of aligned, and we were winning games, and we found ourselves in a playoff spot halfway through this season. And then things kind of came back down to earth. Goaltending came back down to earth. Power play, not so hot anymore. Definitely cooled down. Penalty kill was up and down all season. And then we had the trade deadline where we traded some guys, and it just kind of ended up, we're not making a serious push for the playoffs. Would have been nice if we maybe made it a little bit harder on, Nashville and Dallas, in that playoff push, but, it wasn't happening. We were playing a lot stronger of opponents at the time, too. But overall, it was kind of disappointing at the end of the year. But at the same time, looking back at the expectations for the year, we definitely exceeded expectations. We definitely learned a lot about our team, the young guys, all the rookies. We learned what we had at the goaltender position. Also, that was a nice surprise to see Lankinen step up and even Subban playing well. And then at the end of the year, Delia, we have some options at goaltender. It's not just like we have nobody that can play at the NHL level, which we kind of thought a little bit was going to be the case prior to the season. So overall, a little bit disappointing year, but at the same time, for a shortened season, it wasn't that bad. At least that's kind of my take of this year. I mean, prior to this year, I pretty much just wrote this shortened season off, especially after not having much of a training camp, no exhibition games, shortened 56 game schedule. I was like, whatever happens. We knew we were rebuilding. I'm not going to stress over it. We have an expansion draft coming up in the summer. Things are going to change after this season. Let's just get through it and then go forward after that. So that's kind of where my head was at the entire year. But love to hear your guys' thoughts on how the year went for you or what you thought of the year. Leave them down in the comments section below. And with that said, let's not waste any more time here. Let's talk about the players. We're going to go through each and every one, talking about how they did this season and what we can expect from them in the future. We're going to go through these players in alphabetical order according to their last name, so there's no rankings here. We're not doing that. But there are a lot of players that we're going to be talking about, and I'm going to try and get through them fairly quickly because I don't want this to be like a feature film length video. So without further ado, let's get it on. To start it off, we have Nicholas Beaudin, young defenseman who made one of the largest leaps from last year to this year in terms of development. Spent the year kind of traveling up and down the organization from the Blackhawks to the taxi squad to the Rockford Ice Hogs and back and forth. Played 19 games for the Hawks this season, 2 goals, 4 assists, 6 points. Did a lot of really nice things out there, but, also he's a young player, definitely made mistakes on the defensive end, but very nice surprise this year. And being 21 years old, definitely exciting to see how he hopefully continues to take leaps. Next up is Adam Boqvist, who is another young defenseman, but more of a mainstay on the Blackhawks roster since he's been drafted. Made some nice strides in his development this year, but ended up missing a good chunk of time, whether it be due to COVID or concussions or at the end of the season, a wrist injury. It's easy to look at him and say, why isn't he developing faster, and kind of be a little disappointed. Is he a bust, right? He's only 20 years old. He's fine in terms of his development path. He's doing just fine. The more concerning thing is really, injuries and concussions, I think, with him. Madison Bowey was signed by the Blackhawks to a 2-year deal back in late January. He only ended up playing 2 games for the Hawks, so didn't really contribute a whole lot of anything. More or less just a signing to be someone who would meet exposure requirements in the upcoming Seattle expansion draft. But even that's not really going to be reality since the Blackhawks ended up trading him to the Vancouver Canucks at the trade deadline. Up next is 23-year-old Swedish defenseman Lucas Carlsson, who did some pretty nice things for the Hawks as kind of a bottom pairing 7th defenseman last season. Continued that again this year. He was kind of bouncing around a little bit with the taxi squad. Only played in 12 games and ended up ultimately getting dealt at the trade deadline to the Florida Panthers. Ryan Carpenter probably had a little bit of a down year this year compared to last year, but bottom 6 guy, PK guy, he's not really expected to do a whole lot. Played in 40 games this year, missed a good chunk of time due to concussion. He's a cheap contract, $1 million. We have him signed through next season, so hopefully he has a bounce back year. Next is Brett Connolly, who came over from the Florida Panthers at the trade deadline. Kind of a cap dump by them. Hawks had the cap space to help out and decided to do so. I think he scored in his first game with the Hawks, but outside of that, didn't really do a whole lot of anything noticeable. Got a concussion with 2 games left. Kind of a theme of this season, really. Tough to come to a new team that's not contending near the end of the season, especially in a season like this with the COVID protocols and everything. So we'll see what his future holds. We have him signed for 2 more years at $3.5 million. Maybe a training camp, a new season will help him maybe find his role a little bit better on the team. Kirby Dach, one of those key pieces that we're missing this season, missed a lot of time due to breaking his wrist at the World Juniors right before the start of the season. He did end up coming back and playing 18 games for the Hawks, but even though there was flashes there, he certainly was not 100%. It was nice at the end of the season when him and DeBrincat were playing on the PK. That's exciting going forward. Definitely looking forward to how he does fully healthy and with a full training camp next season. Up next is Alex DeBrincat, who had a fantastic season this year. If you haven't heard, he won my Hawks Recap Blackhawk Player of the Year award. Yeah, just a great season. 200-foot game, all around, forecheck, backcheck, paycheck, right? Power play, PK, as I mentioned with Kirby Dach, awesome seeing him on the PK, and definitely excited about him, creating some scoring opportunities even from being a man down. Just a guy who continued on his development, his full, well-rounded game development this season, and got his scoring touch back, which was great to see. Calvin DeHaan had an up-and-down year this year. Definitely struggled at times, was fighting a hip injury late in the season before kind of getting shut down. Only played 44 games this year. He's the type of guy who might get picked in the expansion drafts, although we'll see. It'll depend on kind of who we end up protecting. But if not, we have him signed for 1 more year. So next year will be his last year on the contract. I don't think he's going to be a long-term stay with the Hawks here or part of the long-term future. So probably next year will be his last if he doesn't get taken in the expansion draft or isn't part of some sort of trade. Colin Delia kind of had a bookending type of season this year. Started the 2nd game of the year, struggled, and then for the rest of the year spent it between the taxi squad and Rockford. And then right at the end of the season, he got in and started a couple of games and did quite well in those games. And, got to maybe thinking maybe he should have played a little bit more during the middle of the season. But at the same time, at that point, the Hawks, were still kind of in the playoff push and their other goalies were doing pretty well. So maybe they just didn't want to kind of risk it at that time. But he's signed through next year, so he'll be pushing for a spot. I don't think he's going to be taken in the expansion draft. I don't think he's going to be protected, but I don't think he's going to be taken either. So we'll have him next year. He'll be fighting for a position. 21-year-old forward Mackenzie Entwistle is next. Got called up to the lineup at the end of the season with about 5 games remaining. Played in those 5 games. Played pretty darn well, I thought. Took advantage of his opportunity. Showed some good speed at times. Got his first career NHL goal. Assisted on someone else's first career NHL goal. There was a lot of that going on this season. But yeah, definitely a positive experience at the end of the season for him. He'll definitely be a guy fighting for a roster spot in training camp next year. Up next is Adam Gaudette. Came over from the Vancouver Canucks at the trade deadline. Only played 7 games this season. Once again, pretty tough to come into a new team, especially in a year like this, but showed some good things. He is a restricted free agent, though, so the Blackhawks will have to re-sign him if they want to keep him. I do expect them to do so. So looking forward to seeing him come next year with training camp and more or less seeing him actually find a role on this team. Brandon Hagel, what a season from this kid. Rookie of the year for the Blackhawks as far as I'm concerned. One of the biggest bright spots, if not the brightest spot for the Hawks this season. Didn't start the first 4 games of the year, but once he got into the lineup, he never left. He was that impressive. Basically reincarnation of Andrew Shaw, but with more speed, just hustling, doing all the dirty work, just super impressive. Definitely excited to see him continue his development next year and hopefully years to come. Next is 21-year-old forward Mike Hardman, who signed as a college free agent with the Blackhawks in late March. Only played 8 games for the Hawks, but man, he threw his weight around. He made the most out of it. He had like 40 hits in those 8 games. Hardworking, hustling type of guy. Had kind of a nice little connection with Mackenzie Entwistle, trading first career NHL goals with him. They both assisted on each other's first career goals, so that was kind of a fun moment. But type of guy who's going to be fighting for a spot come training camp. He's got a chance. Matthew Highmore was the type of player who I think the Blackhawks hoped would develop a little bit better than he had the last couple of seasons. He certainly hustled, certainly worked hard. The effort was there, but just kind of got stuck in a 4th-line role. And with how he scored in the AHL, I think the Hawks were hoping they maybe do a little bit better than he did these last couple of years. Just 2 points in 24 games this season, and I think with all the other young players, young forwards that the Hawks have or liked in their system, they felt like they could move on from him, and so they did at the trade deadline. Sent him to Vancouver in a trade that brought Adam Gaudette over, and pretty much spelled the end of Matthew Highmore's time as a Blackhawk. Speaking of former Blackhawks, Vinny Hinostroza coming back to the Hawks at the trade deadline in a trade with the Florida Panthers, and had a great end of the season. Had 4 goals, 8 assists, 12 points in 17 games. Played really well, and even though he is an unrestricted free agent after the season here, I think both sides probably want to get a deal done to have him back. Definitely would love to see him back, especially if he continues playing the way he did. Up next is Mattias Janmark, who was coming off a Stanley Cup final appearance with the Dallas Stars before signing a cheap 1-year deal with the Blackhawks last offseason. Played in 41 games for the Hawks this year, did a lot of good things, drove play quite well, but we all knew from the get-go that he would be the type of asset you would dangle at the trade deadline, and that ended up coming to fruition. He got traded to the Vegas Golden Knights, and he's been doing well for them. It was nice having Mattias Janmark play for the Hawks this season, but we knew it was going to be a limited run. Up next is 22-year-old forward Reese Johnson, who was former teammates of Brandon Hagel back in juniors, but he only played 5 games with the Hawks this season, threw his body around quite a bit in those 5 games, but otherwise mostly struggled, I'd say. He's definitely a young guy who's more on the outside looking in, but we have him for next year, so he'll be with the organization. You never know what a summer and a training camp will do. 23-year-old defenseman Wyatt Kalynuk is up next. The Blackhawks signed the former Wisconsin Badger as a free agent last July after his signing rights expired. Played in 21 games for the Hawks this season, and I thought took advantage of that opportunity pretty well. Did a lot of nice things. Had his ups and downs like everyone did this season, but definitely looking forward to seeing how he progresses with a full training camp and kind of a more normal season in the organization. David Kampf, the wily veteran nowadays, one of the few players to play in all 56 games this season, one of the only players who could consistently win faceoffs this year as well. He is a restricted free agent, so the Blackhawks will have to re-sign him if they want to keep him. I expect they will. He didn't do anything special, but I thought he was decent, right? For a bottom 6, bottom line guy, thought he was just fine. Yeah, we have a lot of young players and some depth at center in the bottom 6 area, but He's a veteran with this organization. He's been around. He's, once again, one of the only guys who consistently win faceoffs. At the very least, he's a good depth piece to still have on the team. Patrick Kane. Patrick Kane led the team in points once again this season. Had a great first half of the year, was in the Hart conversation, and then scoring cooled down pretty mightily, and he dropped off. We did learn that he was dealing with a little bit of an injury this season. Not quite sure exactly what, but nothing serious apparently. So he should be fine come next season, and he'll once again be Patrick Kane. Up next is Duncan Keith, who, at least in my opinion, showed this year that he probably shouldn't be playing as many minutes as he does. He's got a lot of wear and tear on his body. He's done a lot of great things for the Hawks, but Father Time is undefeated. It would be very beneficial, in my opinion, if, his ice time kind of gets reduced a bit and maybe some other defensemen kind of step up and take on the remaining ice time. He's got 2 years left on his contract, which I think he'll easily be able to complete. He's still very much a serviceable defenseman, even at the ripe old age of 37. But I do believe for the future, these last 2 years, it'd be nice to see him, maybe decreases his ice time a little bit. I think he would be more effective that way. Dominic Kubalik had a very nice sophomore season, showed he wasn't a one-hit wonder, had 38 points in 56 games he played, 17 of those were goals. One of the few to play all 56 games. Him, along with Camp and Kane, were the only guys to do it. Nice season from him. We signed him to a 2-year contract this past offseason, so we got him through next season. So hopefully, he continues this good play. He's a great scoring player to have. Next up is 21-year-old Philip Kurashev, rookie, who showed a lot of great things, especially early in the season. Was on fire at the beginning of the season, but I think just one of those players, one of those rookies who just kind of tired out with the grind that was the season. He played 54 games with the Hawks this year, 16 points, did a lot of really nice things. You could see the flashes. Definitely excitement for him and his future development. Speaking of bright spots, Kevin Lankinen just straight up grabbed the starting goaltending position by the horns this year. Came into the year as basically the third goaltender and just rocketed up the depth chart. Had a great beginning of the year, cooled off a little bit, but he was getting ridden hard by the Blackhawks as they were still in the playoff push, so kind of made sense he would tire out a little bit. But had 17 wins out of the Hawks' 24 wins this season, 909 save percentage. Very, very nice season from Lankinen. Definitely has the inside track of being the starter next year. For as many questions and concerns the goaltending position had this season, Kevin Lankinen certainly helped put an end to that. Next is young defenseman Ian Mitchell, who had a lot of excitement surrounding him coming into the season and made the team out of camp, which was expected. Played very well at times, struggled at times up and down here, very typical of a young defenseman trying to learn the NHL game and trying to defend at that level, which is not very easy to do. It's probably one of the hardest things to do. I know it's very easy to not be patient with our young defensemen, especially with where the Hawks are. We want to try and get back to the playoffs and contend as quickly as possible, right? But defensemen, they take time to develop. Ian Mitchell's only 22 years old. You could see the flashes there. You could see the talent there. He'll continue to develop, especially with a full training camp this upcoming season. He'll be just fine. Definitely looking forward to his future. Connor Murphy, could easily describe him as the Blackhawks' best defenseman out there. Had a solid season, played very well in a struggling year for the defense, but also added leadership to his role this year. Had the alternate captain patch. Definitely loved how he's grown with the Hawks organization since we acquired him in that Nicholas Hjalmarsson trade. He's basically a Nicholas Hjalmarsson light, if you will. But we have him in contract for one more year. It'll be interesting to see if the Hawks decide to, get an extension done prior to next offseason, or if they, wait the full amount. He is 28 years old, so this is kind of Connor Murphy's last chance for a big payday, if you will. So we'll see what happens with that. But otherwise, can't really complain with Connor Murphy and how he's done. He's probably going to be a player that the Hawks protect in the expansion draft. Up next is a player who didn't play at all this season for the Blackhawks, Alex Nylander, who had surgery prior to the season and ended up missing the entire year. He is a restricted free agent, so if the Hawks want him back, they'll have to re-sign him. I assume they probably will sign him to like a one-year deal. I know he hasn't been impressive, in his stay with the Hawks so far. The talent's obviously there, but he just hasn't been able to put it all together. But maybe taking this year off and getting to watch the team from afar and seeing these young guys coming up, these guys who he'll have to compete with if he comes back. Hopefully maybe that lights a fire under him a little bit, and maybe we'll see him kind of turn things around. Who knows? He's only 23 years old. It's tough to kind of remind yourself of that. Next is Brandon Peary, who the Blackhawks acquired from the Vegas Golden Knights back in September in exchange for Dylan Sekera. He played in the very first game of the season, and then that was it. He pretty much spent the rest of the year with Rockford. He is an unrestricted free agent. I don't think he'll be playing with the Blackhawks anymore. I mean, he might be back with the organization, but if he does get re-signed, he'll be playing in the minors once again. I don't think there's really a spot for him in the Blackhawks lineup unless there's just a crap ton of injuries. But once again, he would have to get re-signed. Alec Regula is another one of those young defensemen that the Blackhawks had. Came up late in the year to make his NHL debut, played in 3 games. It was like the only rookie on the Blackhawks who didn't end up scoring his first career NHL goal, so that'll have to wait. But showed some really nice things in his time. Obviously, there's a lot of things to develop and get better at for sure. But once again, another one of those young defensemen that the Blackhawks had. He's only 20 years old. Definitely has a lot of room for improvement, and hopefully he can make the jump or make a couple jumps these next few seasons and maybe find himself more in the lineup. Brent Seabrook never played this year for the Hawks. He's essentially retired now. He was close to coming back for the pandemic playoffs last summer and then looked like he was on track to come back to play this year. But then right around Christmas time, he tweaked his back, and that just never recovered, and that just spelled the end of his career essentially. But he isn't technically retired. He's not filling out the paperwork. He's just going to continue to be on LTIR for the Hawks. So I still figured I'd just throw him in on this list. But yeah, he's retired. His career's over. Andrew Shaw, pretty similar story. He's essentially retired now. Missed a lot of time at the end of last season with a concussion. Came back this year, played really well at the beginning of the year, did a lot of good things. Absolutely loved how he played, how he hustled and got to the front of the net and everything. Typical Andrew Shaw type of play. But unfortunately suffered another concussion, and that pretty much wrapped up his career. So he is done playing, but like Brent Seabrook, he's not officially signing the paperwork, the retirement paperwork. So he's just going to be on LTIR for the remainder of his contract. Zach Smith is another one of those players who didn't play at all this year for the Hawks. He was on LTIR all this year. He had back surgery just over a year ago, back in March, right before the pandemic hit. He's been recovering ever since. This was his last year on his contract. I don't expect the Hawks to re-sign him. He's an unrestricted free agent at the age of 33. It's not really a spot on the roster for him anyway, with all the other players coming up, at least in my opinion. So I think this is pretty much the end of his run as a Blackhawk. That's pretty much it. Next up is Carl Soderberg, who was just like Mattias Janmark, a free agent that we signed last offseason to a cheap 1-year deal. Very much expecting him to be an asset that we dangle at the trade deadline. Was a nice player to have on the team. Big body guy right in front of the net, provided screens. Definitely a great depth center for the Hawks. We ended up trading him to the Colorado Avalanche at the trade deadline, so pretty much mission accomplished for him. And yeah, he was nice to have on the team, but once again, we knew it was going to be a limited run. Riley Stillman is another young defenseman for the Hawks. Came over from the Florida Panthers at the trade deadline, same trade that Brett Connolly came over in as well. Did pretty darn well in the 13 games he played for the Hawks. I thought he did a lot of really good things. Hawks obviously like him enough to get him extended for 3 more years. I think part of that extension also deals with the fact that it also makes him eligible to be exposed in the Seattle expansion draft. But even if he doesn't get picked by Seattle, and I don't think he's going to be protected by the Hawks, even if he doesn't get picked by Seattle, I think the Hawks are completely fine with having him for 3 more years. Up next is Dylan Strome, who signed an extension prior to the season. It took a while for that to happen, but it did get done. And he ended up being one of the better Hawks at the beginning of the season. Started the season quite hot and then got a concussion in late February and missed some time. He ended up playing 40 games this year for the Hawks, but kind of fizzled out near the end of the year and even got healthy scratched in the latter games. His future's kind of up for grabs, at least in my opinion. He's got one more year under contract with the Hawks, but is he someone the Hawks, protect in the expansion draft? I don't know. Is he part of the long-term future for the Hawks? I don't know. Could potentially be a trade piece. It's going to be very interesting to see where the Hawks go from here with Dylan Strome. Malcolm Subban had a nice, kind of surprising year this year. He was, part of the goaltending group that was very much a question to begin this year, and he started the first game of the year and didn't play very well at all, but as the season progressed, you could see him getting better and better. He played 16 games for the Hawks. Some of those games were few and far between, 3 weeks apart, but took advantage of the chances he had, and you could see him improving in each game he played. Like I said, the goaltending position was such a crapshoot prior to this year. We didn't know what we had, and a lot of question marks, with Malcolm Subban as well. But it was nice to see him have a pretty good year, as a backup essentially. He'll be, coming back most likely. He's not going to be protected probably in the expansion draft, but I don't think he's going to be picked either. We have him, Lankinen, and Delia all signed through next year. I assume all three of them will be competing once again for roles next season. Up next is European free agent signing Pius Suter, who had a pretty darn good first year in the NHL. 27 points in 55 games. 14 of those were goals, which was near the top of the leaderboard for rookies. Good first year for sure. Cooled down a little bit as the season went on, but solid year, absolutely. He is a restricted free agent though, so Hawks will need to re-sign him if they want to bring him back, and I do expect them to bring him back. Jonathan Toews, our captain, was out this entire year with something, dealing with something. We don't know what it is. There's a lot of speculation. If you're one of those people speculating, stop it. It's not helping anything. Obviously, we're all wishing him the best and recovering as fast as possible. And there is hope that he'll be back next season. They think he's on a good path to recovery, but still nothing definitive, nothing for sure. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the summer goes and if any news comes out regarding Toews and his status. Lucas Wallmark is up next. He never really grabbed a hold of a role on this team since joining the organization. Just played 16 games this year, in and out of the lineup. Ultimately, he just ended up getting dealt at the trade deadline to the Florida Panthers, along with the other Lucas on our team, Lucas Carlson. That was the trade that brought Brett Connolly and Riley Stillman over, as well as Borgstrom, who we just signed. So that was that trade, and that was pretty much, Wallmark's time with the Hawks. And last but not least, we have Nikita Zadorov, who had a very up and down year for sure. Did a lot of good things well, things that kind of go under the radar because they're mostly just because of the size he has out there, things that other players just can't do. But there are a lot of things he still needs work on. He did get better as the season progressed with his stick handling, but his decision making certainly needs to continue to improve. He is a restricted free agent, but there are reports that the Hawks are in contract negotiations with Zadorov's camp, so it looks like he's going to be re-signed. Now, just because he does get a contract doesn't mean he's going to be back next year. A new contract will most likely make him, exposed in the expansion draft, and I don't think the Blackhawks will probably be protecting him. So we'll see what his future holds, but even if he is back next year, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. Having that size out there on the back end is nice in some ways for sure. Whew, all right. Well, there we go. 41 players. There's a lot of players. If you're still watching, congratulations. Way to go. It's quite an impressive task, sticking through it all. A lot of bright future ahead for the Hawks. A lot of great looking young players. We got the expansion draft coming up. We have the entry-level draft coming up. We'll see what happens with both of those. But for the Hawks, it was a good season. Feeling a lot better now about our future than we were at the beginning of this season. And so we just got to keep going with this rebuild, and hopefully our young guys will continue to develop. That's kind of the road ahead for the Hawks. Let me know your thoughts about this season, about the players, what the future holds. Leave them down in the comments section below. Very much appreciate you watching this video. Like, share, and subscribe. Appreciate that as always. But most importantly, stay safe, make good decisions, and I'll see you next time.